Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast that aims to challenge what we think we know about the ancient world. I'm Flo and I know pretty much nothing about ancient history, so it's a good thing I'm joined by Zenia, our Roman history buff, Alison, whose area of expertise is the ancient Greeks, and Barney, who will regale with tales from the ancient Near East. When we have a fake news fact to disprove, you'll hear the gavel of correction come down to dispel a myth as against the law. So, this week, we're looking at politics. I know about as much on politics as I do about ancient history. So at the moment, I'm aware of some crazy goings on in America. Basically, America is a democratic country, which means it's ruled by the people. So the people vote for who they want to be in control. 4 years ago, many people in America made what was widely considered a bad move and elected a famous actor from Home Alone 2 called Donald Trump to be president. When he got fired, a gang of his friends all turned up at his workplace because they weren't happy about it. This gang holds a deep respect for police officers unless the police officers are trying to stop them committing serious crimes. They believe some other strange things too, like how COVID is both not real and yet somehow genetically engineered, and that Joe Biden is a horrible criminal, even though there's fairly good evidence to say that Donald Trump is actually a horrible criminal, and that wearing a pair of dollar store goat horns on your head and covering yourself in face paint is a good career move. Anyway, they said that Joe Biden would be arrested before he even got sworn in, but they were wrong, and Donald Trump left his job. An old man called Bernie Sanders wore mittens in January, which everyone found really interesting. Lady Gaga showed up, and then Joe Biden did get sworn in, but he didn't even say fuck. So, what is democracy? What does it mean? Where did it start?
Great question, Flo. So, democracy as a word actually comes from the Greek demos and kratos, meaning people and power. It's, power of the people.
So power of the people insinuates that there's another way to lead. I presume that in other places it's not all decided by vote, and throughout history it's not always been decided by the people.
Yeah, quite right. So, I mean, also Athens itself wasn't always democratic either. It was in the 4th and the 5th centuries BC. But immediately before that, in the 6th century, it was ruled by a series of archons, archon being the Greek for ruler. But the beginnings of democratic reforms are usually traced back right to the beginning of the 6th century, in about 594 BC, by an archon called Solon, who decided to give male Athenian citizens a right to take part in the ecclesia, which is the Greek for assembly. And in this assembly, participants would be able to speak on matters that concerned them and the city, and also to vote on different political issues. But it's really worth stressing here that this isn't including women and it isn't including enslaved people. So it's very different from democracy as we see it today, as being representative of people, of a population.
I was going to say, the democracy that we're talking about in ancient Greece, early Athenian democracy, is not the same as what we recognise today as people queuing up to cast their vote at the back of a nursery school.
Yeah, no, exactly that. And especially because it wasn't necessarily always private either. So the way we vote today, we're kind of entitled to our secrecy on who we decide to vote for. But in Athenian democracy, votes would often be done by a show of hands. So you can't really keep it secret what you're deciding to vote for. Not in all cases anyway, there are some exceptions. But also it wasn't representative of all the people in Athens either. You couldn't be enslaved, you had to be male, and you also had to own a certain amount of property to qualify. And it's also worth saying that it wasn't exactly stable at its beginnings. And after Solon's reforms in the 6th century, it did take almost another 100 years to really become an established political system at Athens. In the intervening years, there were tyrants and there were some disagreements about how things should be run. And it's not really until Cleisthenes, who's another archon, in about 507, 508 BC, when Athenian democracy, as we know it, kind of today, is really established.
So that means that they were participating directly in the lawmaking, in the voting, rather than electing a representative, the Athenians were actually doing it all by themselves. Is that right?
So kind of yes and no. So some of the decisions they would be making would actually be decisions on who their representatives would be, because obviously you can't take every decision to the assembly to consult every Athenian citizen on. But some political positions actually would be chosen by lot, so they wouldn't be voted for at all. So, for example, alongside the assembly, the ecclesia, we also have the boule, which was a sort of council or a committee, which would be made up of people who had been selected by lot, and this was on a rotation basis. But yes, kind of in simple answer to your question, all the citizens in the assembly would be participating in political decision making and voting, and it was a majority rule situation. So whatever got the most votes was the thing that they would do.
Power to the people. I like that. So although it's not the same as modern representative democracy where we're electing officials to represent us, that's not to say that it wasn't completely exceptional in the ancient world. I'm thinking from an ancient Near Eastern perspective where they basically had 3,000 years of just kings, despots, emperors, tyrants, everything like that. So individuals, any more than one, contributing to civic matters like that is fairly exceptional in the ancient world. Is that right for Greece?
Yeah, it was seen as being like a particularly Athenian way of organising the state. So it was something that they were particularly very proud of. But again, it's not something that they had all of the time. They had a couple of times that tyrants would overthrow the democracy, but then kind of in retaliation, for example, Cleisthenes, again, who made these reforms on democracy, also put up statues dedicated to the men who actually went out and killed the tyrants and brought democracy back. So they really do kind of lean into this being really a defining feature of ancient Athens.
Having statues is pretty cool. I wonder, are there any statues of leaders? So in the US, I think of Mount Rushmore. And there was a rumour going around that Donald Trump would be added to Mount Rushmore. Not that I think there's any room left, but are there any statues or celebrations of great leaders throughout history?
So yes, actually, in ancient Rome, when they decided to create the position of an emperor, when they became an empire led by a single ruler, they also created an imperial cult, and through that there were an awful lot of statues of, in fact, the very first emperor, Augustus, that were created. There's a specific type of the way he's depicted called the prima porta type, which just pops up like all over the ancient world, sunk at the bottom of the sea off Tunisia, like in the middle of Egypt, all over Turkey. This pops up everywhere, and it really was very much like a branding exercise almost, because having imperial rule was actually a fairly radical thing for ancient Rome. They weren't like Athens in the sense that they always had that this was a contrast between single rule and democracy. With Rome, they had a slightly different system. But what the conflict was in Rome was between emperors and kings. So Romans hated kings, and they had a really, really good reason for it. So actually around the time that Cleisthenes, that Alison mentioned, was making his reforms in Athens, you also have a big reform going on in ancient Rome. The very first king of Rome was Romulus, who gave his name to the city and then the empire. And then after him, there were several more kings, ending with this guy who has a fabulous name, called Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. But Superbus doesn't mean that he was a really great king. In fact, he wasn't. That's why he was overthrown. He was Superbus actually means arrogant in Latin.
I've described things as superb, and I didn't realise I was actually insulting them this whole time.
Well, the meaning's changed over time in English. So in English, you can happily use the word superb in a complimentary sense, but just don't say that to a Roman if you happen to travel back in time.
We'd like to issue a content warning for the topics we're about to discuss. These include sexual violence and suicide in the context of historical legend. If you don't want to listen to these topics, you can skip to 12 minutes and 23 seconds into the podcast. We won't start talking about these topics immediately, so you have time to skip now if you want to.
This guy, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, he had a son who was getting drunk with his cousins one night, and they placed a bet to see what their wives were up to at home. And a couple of them went home, found their wives having their own fun at parties, but one of them, who was called Tarquinius, he bet that his wife would just be at home weaving with her maids. He came home, and yes, she was. Now, unfortunately, Tarquinius Superbus took this as, or Tarquinius Superbus' son, who confusingly has the same name. I'm just going to call him Tarquin. Tarquin took this as a provocation, it seems, and decided to rape this woman whose name was Lucretia. This is it becomes quite an important story because it sort of provides a moral basis for the foundation of the Roman Republic as well, and it's also depicted quite a lot in like Renaissance art. So he comes to Lucretia and he threatens her. He says, if you don't let me sleep with you, I'm going to murder you and your male slave and make it look like you slept with him. So she's not really given much of a choice. Anyway, he rapes her. She calls together her father and her husband and her brothers, makes them swear revenge on Tarquin, and then commits suicide out of shame. This story gets out, and a guy called Brutus, who features a little bit later when we get to the emperors, actually, or his descendants feature later. But remember the name Brutus. He decides to lead a revolution and overthrow the kings and create a republic instead. This story, we have to remember its value in terms of providing this sort of moral basis. It's really problematic reading it from a feminist perspective because Lucretia's only value is in her chastity. And while it's interesting that there is a woman at the center of the story, it's the way she's portrayed that is it feeds into this idea that we've discussed before about Rome being a very patriarchal society.
Thank you for sharing that really tragic story, Zenia. And it got me thinking a lot about Greek mythology as well, a lot of which is based on sexual violence, usually between gods and humans. And I have a question, which is that Greek mythology and history aren't as separate as we might kind of conceive of mythology and history today, because Romulus and Remus, I'm kind of guessing that there aren't firm historical records for that happening, because that's quite a fantastical story that they're like raised by a wolf. So I was just wondering, what are the sources, and is it kind of a myth or is it history? Do we know?
Yeah, so Roman mythology has that sort of similar status that you described with Greek mythology and history. The traditional foundation date of Rome is 753 BC, and then the end of the kings is sort of in the 500s BC. So we don't have any sources from that time. This all gets written down at one point by Ennius in 2nd century BC. And then, but the fullest account that we've got is by a historian called Livy, who, and this is where it gets interesting, he is writing under the first emperor Augustus. So when we're looking at this story of the overthrow of the kings, we have to remember that he is writing this under sole rule again. But he is in a position where he has to justify that and make it really clear that there's a difference between what Augustus is doing and what the kings did. And one crucial aspect of this is that Augustus introduced these sort of moral reforms, which meant that he wanted to promote lots of babies being born, lots of stability in families. These were very sort of socially conservative reforms. So this idea of Lucretia being celebrated for her chastity actually really, really plays well into Augustus's agenda.
So the idea of Romans despising kings as, part history, part foundation myth for later in the Roman Republic and Empire, that hatred of kings comes under an emperor. So are they pitted against one another? The emperor is superior to the king.
Yes, it's a really difficult dynamic that they have to balance here. There was a previous king called Servius Tullius who introduced this sort of republican system of tiered voting, and it is not democratic in the sense that anyone who was eligible to vote took part in the decision making. gradations in society were introduced, and everyone was allocated a certain number of votes that didn't correspond to the number of people in that particular class. So these gradations were introduced so that no one should seem to be excluded from the right to vote, but all the power should remain with the leading men in the state. So this is how the Romans wanted to work it. They didn't really want to change in terms of the kind of oligarchy that Alison mentioned before, or you might call it a plutocracy, plutos meaning rich and kratos meaning power, so power to the rich. But they did want people to feel like they had a bit more of an investment in their own government. So he introduced this system, which after the kings were overthrown, became the sort of standard system. That's what we refer to as the Roman Republic political system. And power was shared between two people, two consuls. Now, in times of emergency, they had this special provision where one of the consuls, or maybe another senator altogether, could take over as a temporary dictator. Dictator is a word that comes from the Latin word to speak. So it means that they're in charge of what happens for a limited emergency amount of time, and then they're supposed to give up their dictatorship at the end when the crisis has been averted. This happens quite a lot in Roman history because it's a very martial state. They're constantly at war. And then it gets to the point where we get Julius Caesar. He declares himself dictator for life, and at one point he is seen in public wearing a crown. Now, this is absolutely unacceptable to Romans.
I'm shocked.
Yeah,
that's horrific behaviour.
Well, this is so funny because in Roman minds, he's done everything you might think of as sole rule, but it's only when he wears the crown that people have a problem with it. So then Brutus, that I told you to remember, this important name, he goes, this is completely unacceptable. We don't have a dictator anymore, which was fine. We now have a king, which is not fine. So he starts this plot against Caesar, and he gets stabbed to death in the Senate. And then Caesar's adoptive son, who starts out being called Octavian, but then is actually awarded the title Augustus, he sets himself up not as a dictator, but as an imperator, an emperor, which is a military term. So again, it's a really, really delicate balance. Augustus has got to walk this fine line between having sole power, having what we would know as a dictatorship, but never being seen as a king.
Do you think he was really self-conscious about, like, people would be like, oh, happy birthday, I've bought you a hat. And he's like, it's not shiny, is it? Just in case someone thinks that he's...
Yeah, he genuinely, that was a valid concern.
Burger King would have thrown a real spanner in the works in ancient Rome, everyone walking around with little crowns on.
Yeah, he'd have to be Burger Emperor, wouldn't he? What would you get? What would you get in your, you get as a little gift with your child's meal at Burger Emperor? Little spears.
Yeah.
So we've touched on ancient Rome, and we've touched on ancient Athens. What's going on in the ancient Near East, Barney? What's happening there? Do they have a democracy?
Well, I think what's quite interesting about what Zenia said there is that the transition from Republic to Empire to Imperial Rome was very messy with lots of civil wars and stuff like that. In the ancient Near East, I think it's a lot more simple. Back in the earliest recorded history, they had someone they called the big man, Lugal, and that was the king, and that was it. And then they had about 3,000 years of kings, basically. And yeah, they do have empires at various different points: Babylonian Empire, Assyrian empires, number of them each. They don't ever call themselves anything different like emperor. They're just king again. So the story is a lot more straightforward in the ancient Near East.
The Greeks were pretty obsessed with the ancient Near East, particularly with Persia, which is probably because they did have a large war with the Persian Empire. But they really loved to kind of fashion themselves in opposition to Xerxes, who was the kind of king at the time. And they loved to portray him as a sort of megalomaniac, basically, like someone who's very arrogant, very proud. There's even a story of Xerxes. He tries to build a bridge across the sea called the Hellespont. And his first attempt at it doesn't go very well. So in response, he has the sea whipped, apparently.
I'd like to go against the law and say that the historical Xerxes is absolutely nothing like the depiction of Xerxes in the movie 300. The film has an approach that it's inherited from the Greek sources that Alison mentioned, that depicts Xerxes as an irrational despot, but it's taken to the extreme. Xerxes is somewhat effeminate, whereas the Spartans are hypermasculine. He's grotesquely pierced all over his body, whereas the Spartans are clean and pure. It's very othering of people from the East, as well as, orientalizing. Just look at his harem with the goat man in it. But yeah, I think I'll save this for another time. I think we could do a whole episode on 300 and other modern representations of the ancient world.
So this bit of history sounds really bloke heavy. There's not many queens about. I always think about the famous one is Cleopatra to me.
Yes, she. So Egyptians do have a slightly better track record of having a few queens mixed in with their kings. Barney, did you want to give a little bit of extra background before I leap into Cleopatra?
There was a pharaoh called Hatshepsut from the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which is one of the most famous ones. And the iconography of being a pharaoh was so entrenched that she often depicted herself with a beard, because that was part of what it meant to be the ruler, whether or not you were male or female. Having that nice wrapped beard that you think of when you think of Tutankhamun was so much a part of the iconography that she had to adopt that as well, despite being a completely legitimate pharaoh. Nefertiti is a famous name, but she was the queen of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. And then obviously, the next biggest name, or the biggest name probably, just thinking chronologically here, comes down to Cleopatra, and that's where things start to get real Roman.
So Cleopatra is contemporary with Julius Caesar, and in fact she is said to have had an affair with him, and she had a son by him called Caesarion. She ended up being the last queen of Egypt, unfortunately, because she got caught up in the civil war, which came about after Caesar's death, between Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and his political rival, Mark Antony. So she sided with Mark Antony, who was also married to Octavian's sister. So this is where it gets really, really complicated. And the thing is, once Octavian takes power as the sole ruler, imperator, emperor, one of the ways in which he tries to sort of consolidate the story of his power is by creating this self and other. And self is Roman, it is male, and other is Eastern, it is Egyptian, it is female. So in order to sort of get over the awkwardness of the fact that Mark Antony, his brother-in-law, and a really, really important figure in Roman politics at the time, Caesar's best friend, was an enemy of the state. So the way he gets around that by just not mentioning Mark Antony at all is by making Cleopatra the villain. So again, this is all part of this misogyny in ancient Rome. A lot of it is down to Augustus saying Cleopatra bad, me Roman good.
Zenia, your point about the Romans othering Egypt is really interesting, and Octavian kind of creating this idea of Egypt as being really female and kind of effeminate and therefore bad, because the same thing is happening with the Greeks and the Persians following the Persian War. And one thing that's kind of strange from our standards today is one thing that they criticized about the Persian Empire is that the Persians would wear trousers, which they considered to be really effeminate. So they really went in on the Persians wearing trousers because they saw that as being a female thing to do and therefore being embarrassing, which is just obviously completely different today. And again, just shows how ridiculous the idea of gendered clothing is.
I was going to say, I find it really funny that they always depict the Amazons, the sort of famous warrior women, as wearing stripy leggings, and they're like, oh my gosh, we would never wear stripy leggings. Such an effeminate thing to do.
I think the ultimate irony of the fact that the Persians get so consistently othered by the Greeks for at such various things as trousers, is that the Persians, of all the kind of ruling dynasties and empires of the ancient Near East, were like the least othering themselves. They were a couple of empires before them were the Assyrians, who were basically like, if you're not Assyrian, you're nothing. The Neo-Assyrian Empire represented like the balance between order and chaos in the world, and they would come and they would conquer a city, a kingdom, a state, whatever, and they would say, "We've just saved you from chaos. Please enjoy this Assyrian order. By the way, you're all Assyrian now, and if you're outside of that bubble, you are other and you need to be conquered." Whereas the Persians, they sort of celebrated the diversity because they had possibly the largest empire in the world at that time. And if you can still see it at Persepolis today on the walls, that they painstakingly represented the detail of all the different peoples in their empire, bringing tribute to the capital. Different dresses, different tools and other crafted items, different hairstyles, different flora and fauna that they might be bringing with them. So they were very, very sensitive to kind of ethnic diversity at the time. And then us as inheritors of the Western tradition, hearing that the Persian is the other from the Greeks is super ironic, because that wasn't something that they epitomized themselves. So Zenia, you mentioned the Imperial Cult, and it does sound like a lot of work in ancient Rome went into how they represent themselves. How extreme does it get?
Okay, so this happens mostly in the provinces, not so much in Rome. And what it would normally, how it would normally take place is they would deify an emperor after their death, because for Romans it didn't really make sense to treat someone who was alive as a god, because they were very, very aware of the inevitability of death. But after they died, they would say, "Oh, okay, we're just going to convert this person into a god now." And they would do this whole ceremony where they supposedly see the soul of this person ascending up to the heavens. So this was how every single emperor gets the title son of a god, divi filius.
And so after a deceased emperor had been deified, were they worshipped? Did they gain a cult?
Major cities would have a small temple, at least, to the imperial cult, where they would sort of worship the institution of the emperor. I suppose we don't necessarily worship the royal family in the UK, but it might be I know some very ardent royalists have almost little shrines in their houses with lots of royal memorabilia. It might be a little bit like that.
Like the plate from Diana's wedding, the memorial plate or something.
Yeah, exactly. Plus some mugs and some egg cups and maybe a little British flag.
I like to think of it in American terms, when people say "not my president," as kind of "not my god." It's interesting that kind of cultic consideration, because I think of divine kingship and deifying kings as something that is massively politically driven, and maybe that's a very modern perspective, but the sort of one time that it pops up or one of the most famous times that it pops up in the ancient Near East is in the Akkadian Empire. So whilst in ancient Egypt we've got divine kings the whole way through, because pharaohs were reckoned as gods, it's a little bit more rare in the ancient Near East. But the first king to be deified in the ancient Near East was called Naram-Sin, who was the grandson of Sargon the Great, whose name has unfortunately been misappropriated in recent times by certain alt-right commentators. So Sargon the Great founded the Akkadian Empire, and then his grandson, Naram-Sin, was deified. And so that means that in representations of himself, he wore the horned helmet of the gods. And when he wrote his name, he used the divine determinative, which I think sounds like a song, but it's just a boring language word. But there's a really clear political reason for it, because basically the Akkadian Empire was the first time there had ever been a collection of what used to be smaller city-states unified under one ruler, and that's super precarious. Every king in the Akkadian Empire saw revolts, and so did Naram-Sin, and so deifying himself is one attempt to give everyone a kind of a motivating ideology to commit to that empire, is that you have a god ruling the empire. This is God given, And they also had to consider that, the temple was basically where the economy was situated. And so by unifying the palace and the temple, by being not just a king, but a divine king, you kind of ensured better control over the rest of the empire by unifying these two major institutions. So, that's why I see it as very politically driven at times, because, there was a real reason, i.e. to stop his empire from falling apart, that Naram-Sin might have been interested in being deified.
Yeah, I can't think of any examples from Greek history where someone is deified. I mean, even in epic, there are these amazing heroes, like there's Achilles, who's meant to be like the fastest person in the world and kind of the most amazing fighter that has ever existed. Even Achilles dies, and there's a kind of very bleak view of the afterlife in this time as well. So what they're fighting for, essentially, and what they're trying to gain in their lives, these heroes, is called kleos in Greek, which in English roughly translates as kind of fame or glory. So what they're really working for is immortality through literature and through kind of history and mythology, which, I mean, they're pretty successful in getting, considering those are stories that we still read today.
Sounds like it's a lot harder for mere mortals to become gods in ancient Greece then, despite what Hercules, the Disney movie, might tell me.
That was really interesting, guys. Thank you. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm going to take away a really fun thing that I've learned today, which is that superb never originally meant the bee's knees. It originally meant arrogant. I really like that. I'm going to start passive aggressively describing things as superb if I think they're arrogant. How about you guys?
I thought it was great to learn how Athenian democracy is absolutely not the same as modern democracy, and I shan't be forgetting that ever again. I don't think we should ever forget, just because we have something approaching universal enfranchisement, it doesn't necessarily mean that voting privilege is available or even accessible and can't be manipulated by people who might want to deny votes to certain regions, sectors, economic bands in society, depending on where they live or what they have access to. So, yeah, we ain't got it all just yet.
Yeah, Bonnie, you're so right. A huge part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was based on the reality that black voters were being suppressed, even though there was the 15th Amendment made in 1870, which was long before, nearly 100 years before, saying that there shouldn't be any voter discrimination on the grounds of race. Black people still weren't able to vote across the board in America in the 1960s. They were being suppressed. And that wasn't politically addressed until a whole load of peaceful protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. So this is stuff that is recent history. It's stuff that's still going on today. It's so much easier for some people to vote than others based on literally geographical location or socioeconomic background. This is definitely not something that's in the past.
I really like learning about the diversity in the ancient Near East and how actually sort of being really tolerant and representing people was almost part of their idea of how to run an empire well.
I really liked the story of Julius Caesar basically being able to get away with being a king until he put a crown on, and that being the straw that broke the camel's back, resulting in quite a brutal assassination. That just seems like quite an insignificant detail that's really been ramped up out of proportion.
I really loved that too. I thought it was really funny, just the concept of, I mean, darkly funny, but just like, oh, you've worn a crown, have you? Well, that's the last straw, mate. You might be doing everything that a king's doing, but the crown is too much.
It's like, aha, we've got you.
Yeah, I draw a line at the crown there. And similarly, I'm going to draw a line under this podcast. Thanks, guys. It was really entertaining and interesting to learn. Our next episode will be about relationships, so grab someone you love to have a listen into our next podcast. Zenia will be cuddled up to Hadrian as she's listening. And as ever, if you've got any topics or suggestions for us for the next episode, please do let us know.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelawpodcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.